Today we have with us Maria Karapetyan, who is going to speak with us. She is an MP with the Armenian government, member of parliament. And we have Miloon Kothari from India, who is a long human rights activist and researcher for many, many years joining us. My co-host tonight is Karapetyan, and we want to just say that this series came about as part of the Jagat campaign, which is a campaign dedicated to the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, and basically aims to raise issues of peace and justice. Tonight, we're talking about bridging human rights forward as part of democracy in the new Armenia. And we want to invite each of the speakers to make a response to this. But before we begin, may I ask my co-host, Karapetyan, also to welcome our viewers.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us with this Jagat series. As everybody knows, the Great March for Nonviolence and Peace was unfortunately terminated or stopped since the coronavirus pandemic has reached us here. However, we're committed to what we're doing, and I think creating, using the space given by the internet to continue our discussions. We've had our first talk just about 2 days ago, and tonight we have the great two speakers to talk about human rights and to talk about what challenges actually we face in general at this time of crisis, but not just really the challenges that we have during the coronavirus, in general, where we are, how, and whatever is called human rights now, where the roots are, and what are some of the understandings of our speakers of what we understand under human rights, how we want to move forward, what are some of the aspects of the general human rights issues that we face in the world today. So thank you, Jill, and I want to welcome our speakers. Without further ado, maybe should we give the floor to Maria and Miloon? Maria Jan, please.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, folks. Thank you for organizing this webinar. Thank you, Jagat, for this wonderful series and for the honor given to me to talk tonight. I'm welcoming all of the attendees that have joined us, and I hope we will have a useful and a good discussion. I especially value the opportunity to talk tonight exactly because of the global crisis that we are in, and it is a crisis first and foremost in issues of health, but also in issues of human rights. In general, these states of emergencies that we have in different countries and societies are truly a machine that comes down very heavily on human rights. And it is also perhaps a time for us to reflect, and those of us that have taken some of our rights for granted at times, it's time for us also to feel what it truly feels like when your human rights are limited, even in times of normality, and to develop this empathy towards each other, because a lot of people actually live in isolation or self-isolation, imposed onto themselves or imposed onto them by society, also in times of non-emergencies. So I think this is also a time of reflection and developing empathy. What I wanted to actually talk about, because I believe that right now I'm in a community where I don't need to defend human rights, something that I usually am forced to do in my role of a parliamentarian in the Committee on Human Rights, both defend but also celebrate. I tonight I want to more give myself the luxury to be critical of the domain of human rights and to point out to two dilemmas that I see myself in the field of human rights and that I constantly cope with as I'm performing this other primary duty of mine of promoting human rights, celebrating them, and defending them. So two dilemmas that I want to talk about. The first is the opposition, the dichotomy between our natural rights and our political rights. So what we have here is that humans are born with these inherent, inalienable rights. The freedom of speech, we know how a baby exercises his or her freedom of speech. The freedom of movement, we know how a child already as a human being born without much of a frame, without much teaching, wants to exercise their freedom of movement. And then because we also live in political societies, then we have this other group of rights that are bound to us being a citizen of a country. The right to vote, the privileges that you have as a citizen in a certain society. And there is a sort of a contradiction, a clash between these two sets of rights, because our natural rights as human beings should be exercised everywhere, regardless of whether we are in the country of our citizenship or beyond it. But that's not the case. The same freedom of movement that's a universal human right cannot be exercised across borders. The political boundaries set a limitation to this very natural human right. And we as human beings are unable to provide ourselves with something that we have declared universal. The same thing also within a certain society. You know, our constitutions, our founding documents, our laws declare that the right to health, to housing, to work are also fundamental to being a human. But again, we can't provide these rights to the fullest on an equal footing to all of our citizens. So it's a constant struggle that we declare these rights as fundamental and for everyone, but there is a long way before we can actually declare them a fact in reality. And the second dilemma is between our individual rights and between group rights. And this is probably a dilemma that's more relevant to the Armenian society, especially in its post-revolutionary period. I find it very difficult sometimes to communicate to my people, to our citizens, why we need group rights. Because usually people make the valid or semi-valid arguments that we as individuals are all equal. Hence, there is no need to have certain group rights, be it women's rights or the rights of what is in law called national minorities or different identity group rights. It's really difficult to explain to people why being equal in our constitution and in our laws does not immediately translate into equality in reality, and how we actually have to have these temporary, even artificial measures of boxing ourselves into certain groups and then providing certain rights that might even feel as privileges for these groups to try to balance out the initial uneven situation that we as individuals are in. Then the question obviously naturally rises, will we ever reach a moment when, for example, men and women will no longer need to discuss these tension between individual rights and group rights? Will we ever reach a moment when we will no longer need to discuss the tension between these identity, the dominant identity in Armenia of an Armenian citizen of Armenian origin and an Armenian citizen of a different ethnic or national or religious origin. And when we come to this moment, then another problem, another dilemma comes to the fore. Will ever people be ready to give up the memory of their struggle? And so, for example, will women ever, if they in actual reality gain the same opportunities and the same opportunity to realize their rights, will they ever let go of the history, or will they prefer to keep hold of it and to remember their struggle? And is this a legitimate claim to remember this struggle and to keep it alive? Probably this much to start the conversation, and I'll be happy to continue contemplating together with everyone else.
Miloon, do you want to make an interjection now?
I was talking about Mahatma Gandhi's contribution on what active nonviolence means. Essentially, he said that we need to be very conscious that human rights do not come without corresponding duties. I think that was a very important message. It's a very important message in the current crisis that we are facing with the COVID virus. It's a very important message in the ongoing and increasing climate change crisis and conflict. Because people, what has happened, I think, is that we have gotten into these situations. Let's say we look at climate change, precisely because people have assumed rights without practicing corresponding duties. They've assumed the rights to consume, they've assumed the rights to occupy nature, and so on. So his contribution began, very far back in 9. He was talking about rights and duties.
Miloon, we've lost you. We've lost your voice. Can you hear us?
He might be coming back, I assume. Let's wait and see.
Yeah, I think basically what he's saying is this active nonviolence. The way to put it into the human rights field is to look both at rights and the corresponding duties, so that you're never only looking at the right side. And what is really interesting is that Gandhi wrote about that as early as 1930, in fact, when he wrote the Declaration of Human Rights in India. And later, it got put into the Constitution of India. So the whole Constitution of India had a Gandhian influence, and it's probably from that point of view that Miloon is beginning to talk, because clearly he's coming from an Indian perspective. But I'm just wondering if he can come back to us.
I will ask our colleagues who are working on the Zoom part to work with Miloon to get him back. But before that, I want to touch upon some of the points that Maria brought up. So I just want to keep the discussion going, because I think that some of the very important things that were brought up that are quite good. I mean, I think Miloon did a great job because we were talking before the actual video conference started, and I think what he was talking about is where Gandhi, before even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the legal documents, League of Nations and the UN started touching upon, Gandhi was talking about the same thing, and that's, I think, quite understandable and reasonable. But Maria was talking about the conflict in individual and the group rights versus group rights that comes up, and especially with her position, someone who has been an expert, a scholar in the civil society, and now being in a different position of governing and carrying political and legal responsibility. It's interesting. I want to ask a question about, before we get to larger issues like women rights or any specific group rights. What's the conflict of different positions and angles when you are talking about rights and you're talking about how do you read the same laws from different perspectives is what I want to put, just to make it simple and blunt. Is it a matter of interpretation? Is it a matter of a different type of responsibility, or is it something else?
Well, definitely, Arsen, you have touched the heart of my crisis as an individual moving from civil society and academia to a political post. The thing is that I don't enjoy the luxury anymore of being critical of the domain of human rights the way I could afford when I was in civil society and academia. The one example also for is in this realm of individual versus group rights is that all my in my previous professional experiences, I have been very critical, for example, of the word combination national minorities. I have criticized that it reproduces, Miloon is back. I've criticized that it reproduces inequalities. The word minority is problematic. The way we conceptualize the word national is problematic. And we, in our pursuit of solving problems, we're actually creating and reinforcing other problems. But now in my political position, I don't have the luxury of being so critical. I actually have to defend even the little bit that there is and try to build on it and improve the language with which we talk about human rights. So yes, it is a daily struggle for me as a person to leave the critical views that I personally might have to this or that issue, and to protect or celebrate, as I said in my introduction, the smallest common denominator that we have, and to cherish it and try to improve it, rather than constantly also be critical of it and diminish even the importance of the little thing that we have.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, and welcome back, Miloon.
Thanks very much.
Trying to before you came back, we touched upon a little bit about the conflict, or not a conflict, but of course the situation where you are in different positions and are talking about the same thing. In case of Maria, it's a very specific case, and that is going from civil society to political position, and how you tackle the same terminology or the same issues in a very different position. And we were kind of trying to cover the time before you come back. And with this, I want to suggest that you, because it seems like your connection is much better. With this, I want to suggest you maybe start over from the very beginning, because we would have lost a lot of what you've been saying, because it has been going on with fractions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Arsen. And can you hear me now? Is it better? Yeah.
It's great.
Okay. So I was speaking about Mahatma Gandhi's contribution on nonviolence and human rights, and essentially saying that one of his main contributions, which is with us today and which has inspired thousands of people around the world, is the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence. But his major sort of point of departure, which is what has left a long legacy, which is very relevant today, was that ahimsa has to be an active precept. It's something that the struggle for peace, human rights, social justice cannot be achieved without action, and we all need to act. And this is a very critical message today in the context of the COVID virus, in the context of what is a worsening climate change situation, in the context of conflict. And one of his ideas, which he in fact practiced throughout his life, was the notion of human rights and corresponding duties. That you cannot have human rights without the practice of duties. That in fact duties come first. And in the current, let's say, the climate change crisis, this becomes very important, because we all know that the horrible situation we are in with the slow destruction of the planet is precisely because people have assumed for over a century that they have assumed that they have rights without practicing corresponding duties. And these are ideas that he developed all the way back in 1909 when he wrote his seminal work, Hind Swaraj. But his first contribution, which then very much influenced one of the articles of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, was in 1947 when, in a response to a call by UNESCO for eminent people around the world, they put out a call that if there is to be a universal document, what would the content be? He actually wrote that, and I'm quoting, and he said, "I learned from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights to be deserved and preserved came from duty well done. Thus, every right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship of the world." And this is very critical today. And he continued, "From this one fundamental statement, perhaps it is easy enough to define the duties of man and woman and correlate every right to some corresponding duty to be first performed. Every other right can be shown to be a usurpation hardly worth fighting for." Of course, this idea was brought to the debate, the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and Article 29 of the Universal Declaration actually very, very clearly points out this notion of rights and duties. And there is, so this notion of rights and duties now is what he also talked about, the idea of a global citizen, one who has rights but must practice duties and responsibilities. And he went further by saying that actually the duty that we have is not only to others, but first begins with ourselves. And he said, if I do my duty, I serve myself, I shall be able to serve others. And later on he said, my life is my message. But he said, to be able to prepare yourself to be a satyagrahi, to be able to protest, to be able to have resistance, you have to first prepare yourself. And I think this is a very strong message when it comes to lifestyle, when it comes to consumption. It's also a very strong message for young people today. The kind of self-control that we need so that we do not continue to get into the crisis that we have. And then he said, once you are ready for that, you have a duty to others in the world. So you have a duty to practice. And his famous quote was that an ounce of practice is worth a ton of preaching. So for example, when we think of the COVID crisis, when we think of climate change, how we live has a very strong bearing on what happens in the planet and how we can collectively overcome the crises like we have today with the COVID. And I think, Maria, I want to respond partly to that there are situations in the world where we do have to sacrifice what we consider to be our inalienable rights when there is a larger good that is at stake. And this is the idea then that Mahatma Gandhi developed into his concept called Sarvodaya, which was oneness of the world, that all living beings across borders, religions, ideologies, tradition, regardless of race, color, or nationality, we have to be aware of that. And that is what it means to be a citizen of the world. And his second idea, which I think is really very, very critical today, is in the quest for this new world order at that time on human rights, peace, and social justice, was his talisman. I don't know if everybody is familiar with that. I want to read it out because I think it's very important. He said, and I quote, "I will give you a talisman whenever you are in doubt or when the self becomes too much with you. apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest man or woman whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him or her. Will he or she gain anything by it? Will it restore him or her control over his or her own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to Swaraj, which was his other concept of freedom, for the hungry and spiritually starving millions? And he says, then you will find your doubts and yourself melting away. This notion of meeting the needs of the most vulnerable first, as we all know, is a foundational principle of human rights. It's also something that's now been taken on in a somewhat diluted form by the Sustainable Development Goals, which the slogan is leave no one behind. But I think today, so for example, when we think of the COVID virus situation, when we think of the Roma in Europe, when we think of refugees, when we think of homeless and landless people and migrant workers, it's a very powerful message that whatever steps we take, whatever we do, we have to make sure that the vulnerable do not suffer and become even more vulnerable. And finally, I wanted to also point out another concept which I think is very critical today, is his notion of trusteeship. It's something that he developed. It was the concept of non-possession and trusteeship. And I think in the time now of planet-wide economic problems, environmental destabilization, perhaps it is necessary for us to examine ways of limiting wants and sharing what we have more equitably. And his recommended method he called trusteeship. So in fact, when we get over this COVID crisis, it's very important for us to think of what is often called degrowth, to say that how can we go back to living in a way in which it is not there is not so much of exploitation. So I think that the preponderance of conflict across the world, the constant threat of devastation from climate change, compels us to recognize the contemporary relevance of the ideas of global solidarity and commonality of purpose that were espoused by Mahatma Gandhi. And given the multiple crises the world faces today, as I mentioned, from conflict to climate change, and now with the COVID, the point I wanted to make was, can we draw lessons from the powerful ideology of nonviolence and the concepts of Sarvodaya, one world, that were some of the core messages of Mahatma Gandhi's life and work? And can we not recast Mahatma Gandhi's visionary balance between nationalism and internationalism? He had said that part of nationalism has to be ceded so that there is an international order based on human rights and justice. And then the necessary corrective of duties done and human rights acquired. So that's what I wanted to share just as a beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Miloon. Thank you so much. I've taken out a couple of points and questions that I'd like to ask, but before going there, maybe Maria, do you want to touch upon some of the points and elaborate?
The only thing that I want to reinforce, perhaps bridging what Miloon has said and what I was trying to say at the beginning of my first intervention, is how this global crisis has halted a lot of the practices that we took for granted, like this consumption, and it has forced us to stop. And we have this abundance of time and space to ourselves. And the most useful way to fill this time and space that we have to ourselves is with reflection, to try to understand what it feels like, develop this sort of empathy towards people that can't exercise their human rights even under normal conditions. And now we are put in the same place that is the usual lives of a lot of people around the world. And to try to think how we can rethink our systems in general, to have them, in these days, we see that there are so many meetings, so many things that we fill our time with, and we can do without them. So the virus has taught us to unload our lives from all of the load that proves to be unnecessary, and to actually have other practices that might be more useful, more non-violent, and more friendly towards ourselves, people around us, and our communities. So I do want us to treat this as an opportunity to learn to better our systems, to better our relationships, and to better our communities.
Yes, I would agree, and thanks for endorsing that. I think that what is critical, when we went through the economic crisis earlier in the 80s, it was again a major opportunity, but unfortunately the world did not, including all the progressive people, the human rights movements, the peace movements, everyone was not able to take advantage. So I think what we need to do collectively now, as you say, Maria, when there is a time to reflect, is to see if governance has to happen in a different way, if multilateralism has to happen in a different way, if countries have to be held accountable for their human rights obligations in a more effective way, then what are the types of policy prescriptions that we would recommend? I mean, if a government was to say, okay, we have learned the lessons and we want to, redo our economic policy, or we want to have a more sensitive policy towards vulnerable people in our country, how would you actually switch from the current largely privatization neoliberal model into a more human rights based model? And I think that's really the challenge. And in that context, I feel that I very strongly feel that some of the ideas that Mahatma Gandhi left us with, including of Sarvodaya, of trusteeship, can be very, very useful.
Thank you, Miloon, and thank you, Maria. One question, and I think both of us, both of you have touched upon, which is, Maria more than Miloon in this case, which is, in a way, this coronavirus situation has made us maybe function in a different situation. Can we say that this is kind of a global stop to some kind of an insanity that is going on? And this is a very general question, of course, but I would actually love and appreciate your take on this, which is like hold back and kind of slow down and rethink. Maria just talked about it, and of course Miloon has been talking about it, and Gandhi himself has been talking about inner peace and stopping, of course. And then one specific question with regards to the idea of basically corresponding duties, or in a way saying that it is first my duty and I have to individualize or personalize it before I ask for anything from anyone. And this is, if I understand it correctly, in that you don't constantly kind of expect or ask whether it's the state. Like we lived in socialist states where it was top down, and you knew that you can always complain about someone or something, while we see a lot of the Western capitalist systems where it's all about individuals and your destiny is in your hands and all that, and a lot of the weak social policies there. So I don't want to get into that discussion, but can we say that at this age of internet, this coronavirus situation has made everyone kind of act with their own corresponding duties, and some taking advantage of it, especially at conflicts like where or I don't know, thieves or whatever. I mean, whatever level, right? I mean, how much are we observing people taking advantage of this situation, and how much of this social responsibility or on the individual level corresponding duties or that of the personal responsibility are we observing from your experience and your general social experience?
Maria, do you want to go first?
You go ahead, Miloon. I'll follow.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's actually a major opportunity. You know, when people have been talking about rights and duties, it's often sounded like a sort of a theoretical construct. It's often sounded like an idealistic thing that people are dreaming. This is never going to happen because people are around the world are just used to consumption. They're used to exploitation. They're used to a private property model. And they're used to speculating. But I think the climate, and Arsene, you're very right, this COVID issue has actually brought us face to face with why it's important to have duties. And what I see generally, and I see it in my country, in India, that it's incredible, the solidarity that we see. You know, our whole country is under lockdown, 1.3 billion people, and people are overwhelmingly are complying with all the severe restrictions because they feel that there is a larger good at stake, because they feel that the country needs to, as a country, come out of this crisis. And I think that if we can keep that collective solidarity spirit after the COVID crisis is over, that would be a major development, because people also realize that people have suddenly realized that our air is cleaner, our rivers are cleaner. People realize what we are doing to our cities, and I think that consciousness that has come in. Also, I see that people are much more conscious of labor. We have people who are suddenly realizing how much lower income people, whether it's migrant workers or it's the sweepers on our streets, how much essential work that they do. People are now at home having to cook. They've never cooked before. There's a kind of a sort of a consciousness of the other, which was always seen as a, oh, these people, we don't think about them. And now these people are being celebrated. And so I think that this new sensitivity that has come, both at an individual or a family level, but also at a national level, is really fantastic. But I think that, but the challenge is going to be, how do you sustain that? I mean, how do you stop people from rushing back to the malls, or how do you actually continue that? And that's why I was mentioning that, again, very powerful idea of degrowth, that how do we as a world go into an economic system which is not so heavily dependent on consumption, or how do we have economic models that are not, the gross national product and all that are not so dependent on people buying all the time and people speculating all the time.
Yeah, I think if I may just interject before Maria comes in, it would be interesting, Miloon, if you link that with the notion of trusteeship. So
Yeah.
Gandhi had the idea of duties, but the reason we naturally feel duties is because we are trustees. And therefore we have a responsibility. So Maria, you have, as one of the, 24% women in the Parliament of Armenia, have become somewhat of a trustee of those issues, those human rights issues, which you've been deeply steeped in for the last many years. You are feeling your responsibility to the government. And I think if I can just use that as an analogy to say that if people feel more as trustees, they're less likely to allow themselves to consume without control, because there's a sense of responsibility. So I just wonder if you can, Miloon, just develop the notion of trusteeship a little more.
Yeah, I completely agree. Jill. I think that so this idea of trusteeship is that we are on the planet and we have been bestowed. Sorry, let me just. The idea of trusteeship is that we are on the planet, in a sense, as guests, and we have bestowed with life, and we need to continue it. And I think that it's also very closely tied to Gandhiji's concept of the talisman, right? That the most vulnerable people. But it's also very closely tied to what indigenous, aboriginal, tribal people have been telling us for a very long time. In the Native American, in their writings, in their oral traditions, they always say that every step that you take, think of the seventh generation. How will it affect the seventh generation? So I think these are very powerful concepts. And in Gandhiji's work, in Mahatma Gandhi's work, the notion of trusteeship essentially he was appealing to business. And he was saying it was essentially to delegitimize the gross accumulation of wealth. So it was what a scholar has called actually in the final analysis, someone has written that trusteeship is a principle of economic conscience. And I think that's what we need to develop. Like, what does economic conscience mean? If you think of the economy as being geared towards achieving social justice and human rights and peace first, what would it mean? How would it be designed, or what would be the framework? So I think these ideas of trusteeship, talisman, again, one of the foundational principles of human rights, to meet every policy and every law, every administrative action should meet the needs of the most vulnerable first, before you get to anybody else. All of these are very powerful ideas. The challenge, of course, is how do we implement them? And I think the current crisis has definitely thrown new light into this and brought new energy into it. And again, I would say the challenge is how do we sustain this energy?
Thank you, Miloon. Maria?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I agree absolutely with you, Arsen, that this is a time that it's a crisis, and usually in times of crisis, there is a lot of mobility. People move around trying to save the situation, do something. But this crisis is very unusual because it has actually stopped us all and given us all the time needed to actually start the process of reflection. So yeah, this crisis is very unusual in that way, that it has made us think of the things that we usually take for granted. It has isolated us, but made us think about community and solidarity. It's again, a situation filled with a lot of dilemmas. As a parliamentarian, as a person who has this position of quote unquote power, it's always very, very difficult and very limiting to talk about responsibilities and duties. And we do come under criticism when we try to vest responsibilities with citizens instead of talking about our responsibilities and vesting citizens with rights. The only way I can appeal to this is through the political ideology of my party, where individual effort is a fundamental core value that we talk about ourselves as politicians, but also invite our citizens to prescribe to that ideology, that one human being can start change through their own action and invite others to join into that action. The famous formula of 1 + 1 + 1, and the idea of how important individual effort is, even in isolation, even if it hasn't gained traction with everybody else around you. It's important to persist, to continue on that path, and to pursue what you think is right as an individual. In terms of what Jill brought up about women's representation in parliament, again, it's very problematic and very limiting for me to talk about this, because I can I can't speak in the name of all women. I can't even speak in the name of young women. I can try to represent as much as I can, but it is again very difficult because our experiences are very different. Carrying the voice might be a very illusionary task that I might trust myself with. So there needs to be a constant critique of this role of representation in parliament as well. And on the other hand, we do have men in parliament that also try to push forward women's agenda, and I do very much appreciate the effort of all my colleagues, be them men or women, that try to somehow make this part of their agenda, regardless of how good of a job they do representing. But the efforts I appreciate a lot.
Great, thank you, Maria. Miloon, before you go ahead, I want to suggest that we read, because there are some questions that our participants have posed. I want to suggest reading. One is for Maria, one is for Miloon, and the one is quite a general one. You could read it yourself, but I'll read it so that you can respond. I think it's better. So Catherine Winkler asked a question. I'll just read it quickly. First of all, thank you. My question is for Maria. Our human rights are given life or have life taken away in the context of power. How can we can have this conversation outside of the context of the dominant militaristic and patriarchal culture? If you understood the question in its entirety, please go ahead, Maria.
It's a complex question, of course. Thank you very much, Catherine, for posing it. Yeah, that's what I was also trying to say, that human rights, I used to have the luxury of critiquing this paradigm, because as part of civil society, as part of academia, I could see how states bind their citizens using the discourse of political rights. States give privileges to their citizens and bind them to them, because they claim to protect their citizens within the boundaries of states and beyond them. But these concepts and states are naturally connected with militaristic ideology, and they do have an inherent connection with armies and patriarchy. This is the, let's say, cutting edge of academia, and this conversation needs to be there. And there is this conflict between our natural human rights and how states provide for these privileges of citizens and actually limit our natural human rights. That was my also opening statement, that I cannot exercise my freedom of free movement as a human being on the whole surface of this globe, because I'm bound by citizenship to a state that claims to protect me, but at the same time limits my human rights in the name of these political privileges that it gives me.
I'm apologizing for my interjection. I'll give the floor to the Miloon. Beautifully put on. You're bound by your citizenship. How free are we to actually become global citizens? And what is the trade-in?
Is this to me, Arsen?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. I think that right now I don't have a solution. I can't offer the details of the architecture of global citizenship. What I can say is that we need to keep this conversation alive and continue thinking together in harmony in different parts of the world about how we can make these tension between our political rights and our human rights dissipate, how we can find more just structures of coexistence on this planet. I don't have a solution right now, and again, I'm very limited with my position, with my political position, to offer these protective layer of citizenship to our citizens. So right now I'm actually participating on the other end of this conversation, but I am very happy to think together with everyone else how we can actually push that conversation and that thought forward of how to reach more just structures globally.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I can also respond, I think that again, it's useful to go back to the sort of visionary balance that Mahatma Gandhi struck between nationalism and internationalism. Essentially, the formation of the United Nations was something that he contributed to, and I think by ratifying, agreeing to so many international human rights instruments, states have actually ceded a part of their sovereignty. So I think the UN has a very, very important role to play, and I think we all need to collectively also support the work that the UN is doing. And I think it's very important to think to also reflect on what has been achieved. So I just want to give one very recent example of the recent adoption by the General Assembly of the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas. This came out of a transnational movement led by a group called Via Campesina of poor peasants, and then resulted in global standards, which we are all now trying to see how they can be implemented, at the national level. So I think that we have the framework, Maria, for that, what global governance would look like, and we have a body, we have, and many bodies within the UN, and I think it's really up to us to challenge, to sort of play that role and to challenge our states to uphold the obligations that they have taken on.
Thank you, Miloon. Jill, are you seeing the questions that are posted with our panels? Do you want to read the next ones, maybe? You have to turn on your mic. We can't hear you.
There's a question from Miloon from Reva Joshi on this notion of connecting degrowth to this to the discussion on human rights. Can you elaborate on how you see degrowth is an important example, Miloon?
Yes, thanks very much for the question. I think when we think about the implementation of human rights, and we think about meeting the rights of the most vulnerable first, obviously we get into issues of reducing income disparity, even changing the debt structure from the north south to the north, and we have to think of how you reduce the power and the wealth that are there amongst the top 1%, 10%. So I think that if we are to slow down, and I think Maria used the word slow down, and if we are to rethink of the world so that we come out of this crisis, but also that we deal directly with climate change, I don't see any other way of doing it but by degrowth. Degrowth essentially means you have to cut back on consumption. You have to rethink the basic economic principles that are based on the gross domestic product and so on as being the main criteria for the health of countries. And I think you have to localize, and even now people are thinking, okay, so why do we have so much export and why do we have so much trade? Why can we not have things ourselves? What Gandhiji's called the self-sufficient model, the local model of self-sustaining communities and villages, and so I think there's quite a lot of work that's been done on degrowth, and I think it's very important to link that degrowth work with not only what Gandhiji was talking about, duties and responsibilities, but his whole notion of trusteeship, of sharing, and of essentially delegitimizing the gross accumulation of wealth, because it's that which has brought us to where we are.
degrowth must be based on a sense of needs, no?
Yes, of course. It's based on a sense of basic needs that, and I think, again, Mahatma Gandhi said it very, very powerfully when he said there's enough in the world for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. So essentially, it's, I don't know if we can use the word degreeding, but we have to make people less greedy. We have to make basic, the basic needs available to all. And we have to have an economy that recognizes the value of the very people who produce what we need for basic needs, the farmers, the people who are actually very often forgotten. The whole notion of land reform has been forgotten. So the rights of farmers, the rights of, so I think it's a complete turnaround of who we think are the important players. The important players in a national or a global economy are not the corporations. The important players are the small producers, the small businesses, and their value has to be raised. And I think the virus has actually done that. So the challenge is, how do we continue after the crisis?
Thank you, Miloon. I think there is one more question for our panelists today, and it's come from Catherine. Again, it's another additional question: that how do we, in our aspiration to walk the path of ahimsa, work with the underpinning of gender inequality? So gender is coming into the equation. The question is a little longer. I want to maybe suggest that maybe our speakers touch upon generally the gender issue. Both Maria and Miloon, I'm sure, have quite a lot to suggest on this, and I would slowly but surely get into a conclusive side, because we've been on air a little more than an hour, if you don't mind.
Maria, maybe you can go first.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the question. It's the one that Catherine asked, bringing the example about Lebanon. In Lebanon, domestic violence has increased 100%, in France 40%. I'm assuming this is in the context of the virus? Or,
correct. I think that's what she's claiming to be, yes.
I work with underpinnings of gender inequality. Well, I think this situation with the virus has also underlined some of the problems. Of course, it's a time that we have stopped and we're reflecting and rethinking, but it has also aggravated some of the problems, or at least we think it might have aggravated some of the usual problems we face in our societies, of course, be it for example, poor families trying to make ends meet, now having no opportunity to even have the small daily jobs that they usually earn their living with, or there has been, our attention has also been drawn to the fact that a lot of families that experience domestic violence are put in more difficult situations, the victims in these families, because this isolation also means spending more time together with people from whom there is a constant threat emitting, and also the stress that's put on relationships might have an effect of how people deal with these stressful situations. The virus has aggravated a lot of the problems that we experience with lower doses in our quote-unquote normal lives. And to be honest, other than increasing the response mechanisms of emergency hotlines, I can't imagine much that we can do in this situation. And then understanding that when things return to normal, we need to actually draw our lessons from this situation of crisis and accelerate the reforms that would prevent from a similar situation repeating again. So, for example, this conversation about helping or pushing more citizens into registering their jobs, because as we find out, the state has more willingness and more instruments to help the citizens that have registered jobs than the ones that are initially in even more vulnerable positions of having no registered jobs. The same with issues of interpersonal relationships and domestic violence, that in times of crisis, these situations are going to get aggravated. So we need to have mechanisms in place to respond to this sort of developments in times of crisis. And of course, these are just two examples, but of course, a lot of the issues become more prominent also in times of such crisis.
Okay. Yeah, on the question of gender inequality and the link with nonviolence, I mean, obviously, you know, women, we've seen all over the world, bear a disproportionate burden of whatever inequality there is. And I think the message of nonviolence is very important if it comes to, you know, issues of domestic violence, armed conflict, ethnic conflict. And so I think if we go deeper into that message and there is more education, and I think one of the failures of the education system in the world that these basic principles of humanity are not taught. And I think if they are, perhaps it obviously places an obligation, let's say, on men to not you know, practice violence. But I also just wanted to make a quick point before we end, which is that since we've had the COVID thing, there's been another reflection where we have found that we have seen that even in the most powerful and the wealthiest countries, the health systems were completely incapable of dealing with this crisis, right? If you think about the United States, you think of the United Kingdom, and perhaps this will lead to a reflection within those and other governments which have, you know, systematically dismantled their social welfare systems, that will lead to a reflection that we need to invest more in our health infrastructure. We need to invest more in our labor infrastructure, so that you know what Maria was talking about, the burden on informal workers, registration, and so on. And I think if we can move towards more policy prescriptions like this and ensure that you know, not so much is spent on the military and on security, that would be a fundamental change, which has been very difficult to bring about, even to have a discussion at the UN or elsewhere before this crisis. And maybe this crisis gives us that opportunity to ask these fundamental restructuring questions, like why do governments spend so much money on defense? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it would be good now, Arsen, if I could suggest we have a closing statement from both of our panelists, and finding it so interesting to see Maria, who's really in the trenches on the front lines doing her daily political work in the defense of human rights, and Miloon with your more reflective position in terms of nonviolence, Gandhi, and the larger global solidarity that is required at this time of COVID-19. So I think both of your presentations have been really very, one more practical front line, one more looking at the broader implications. And I hope that in the new Armenia, in which you're a leader, Maria, with all of these young MPs which have joined the government in the last election, that you'll be not only open to the COVID virus giving you new ideas, but taking it into action in future. It'll be wonderful. So as a final statement, maybe you could just leave the viewers with a sense of how do you see really taking human rights forward right now in Armenia, Maria?
Maria Jan, before you start, just to add, because Jill posed, and it's good, there is a question to you that I want to just maybe read quickly so that you can include it in your answer. It's about, generally, Ria Simon has asked a question, and she's asking about the safety of or fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, which can eventually lead to surveillance or violation of human rights, including rights to privacy. And she was talking about laws or policies in Armenia that are being implemented for safety and fighting. I mean, this has been a complicated and, of course, controversial topic inside Armenia, but generally saying, if you can touch upon that as well, so that we don't have, because we only have 7 questions, it would be a shame to leave anything outside.
Of course. Absolutely. The state of emergency has put us decision makers in a position where we have had to put on the 2 ends of a scale the health of the society as a whole and of individuals on one side, and certain human rights on the other side. And Armenia we have taken the decision to limit many of the rights that our citizens, I hope they enjoy in, again, quote unquote, normal conditions. That is even the right to private life. And there has been this whole controversial discussion about phone calls, the connections people make with each other, and then being tracked as they move with their phones to try to figure out who might be the circle of people that they have communicated with, and if they have the virus, who might be the people that they might have passed on the virus to. And these have been very difficult decisions that we have taken, and they haven't been easy decisions at all, and we keep apologizing for these decisions, because apart from being necessary, my personal perspective is that these limitations also teach authoritarianism, because people also get used to bigger surveillance. And I hope this state of emergency doesn't last too long, so people don't get used to being tracked, because
don't use the word surveillance. It's not becoming.
What's that?
People not getting used to being surveilled. They're not.
They're not, and I'm actually very happy with the amount of resistance we have gotten, because it means that it's not okay. Of course, we understand it's not okay. It's not something to be all comfortable with. It's a big discomfort, and that's how it should be. But we have believed that this has been a necessary measure to take. And to Jill's question, yes, the state of emergency and these extraordinary measures that we have taken have also heightened the sensitivity of everyone towards their rights, towards the rights of others, and it's a good thing. In the long term, we should take these energies, and I'm sorry for these maybe consumptionary wording. We should use these energies to push the agenda of human rights forward beyond the state of emergency. It's wonderful that we have all suddenly become so possessive about our rights and our freedoms and the non-surveillance. And I hope that in the post-virus context, this is going to help us push the idea of human rights forward, also telling to ourselves and telling to people that see how bad it is when human rights are limited. So let's give each other these luxury of enjoying rights. But at the same time, I also want to acknowledge that we constantly keep talking about this crisis as an opportunity, and that's wonderful, but it's also okay to completely have these moments when we completely immerse ourselves in depression and are sad and don't want to feel inspired by this opportunity and just want to feel sad for a while, and that's also a normal human condition. I don't want us constantly to put ourselves and to push people to view the crisis as an opportunity. Yes, it is an opportunity in certain senses, but it is also okay that it causes a certain level of suffering, and if we want to be unhappy about it, it's also a very human thing to just sit and be unhappy for a while. I'm sorry for this pessimistic note, but I think it's also worth saying.
No, as they say, never let a good crisis to go to waste, right? You have to become a politician.
Right. Yeah, so let me end on a more positive note. I think that this crisis we're going through has really given us an opportunity to reflect, but also, you know, as Maria was saying, we've all gotten used to having less rights. Many of us cannot even leave our homes. And I think that if we go forward after the COVID crisis, some of those limitations have to remain, not necessarily, you know, us not being able to go out of the house. But for example, I've never understood why states allow unbridled consumption. I mean, why should one family have 4 cars? Why should somebody have 8 houses? I think there have to be limits that are placed if we want to save the planet and if we want all of us to survive. And my main sort of message would be that let's please go back to the remarkable work that was the legacy that is left to us by Mahatma Gandhi of ahimsa, of, you know, non-violence, of satyagraha, of resistance. We are all going to have to go out on the streets again if we want the world to keep improving, but we have to resist in a non-violent way. We have to think of a different concept of freedom, of Sarvodaya, one world, and of trusteeship. And I would urge everyone to go back to those times, go back to those writings, go back to those ideas, and try to, as I have been incredibly inspired by that for my work, to be inspired so that we can individually and collectively carry forward the struggle for global solidarity and human rights and social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, thank you, Maria, thank you, Miloon, for such an interesting interaction. Obviously, we're at a very interesting point of history, and you've made some incredible observations about people's rights at this time. And I thank Arsen for being part of helping to bring forward some very interesting questions and ideas. So from this side of Jai Jagat and Restart, let us thank you all, and please remain with us for the next 13 talk shows that will be happening every second day until May 2nd. And we really, really look forward to a meeting and following both of your works in future. Thank you very much. Jai Jagat.
Thanks very much. Jai Jagat.
Thank you very much. Thank you.